I grew up watching shows like This Old House and Iron Chef, where trained professionals applied and showcased their skills for the general public. These shows were not only visually compelling, but often I was able to learn something about their craft, or at the very least, come to understand or appreciate their professional approach. Recently, I wish there was a similar format that walked viewers through the day-to-day work of a historian. I think most people know that historians produce particular types of work: books, exhibits, documentaries, and other scholarship. But how do they produce that work? I've always been fascinated by that process, the exploration of sources, the questions we pose, and the larger meaning we seek. That's why I'm pulling back the curtain on the profession with This Old Historian, a new feature from the History Tavern podcast, hosted by me, Nick Toney. Think of this as an open-door workshop where I'll show you the fascinating reality of how we hunt down clues, cross-examine sources, and build a narrative from scratch. This AI-generated graphic boils down the process. We often start with a question or a curiosity. We engage with a variety of primary sources: letters, newspapers, memoirs, government records. Regardless of your level of training or experience, your perspective, who you are, has the potential to bring new meaning to the material you're engaging with. We also have the advantage of consulting and reading existing histories on whatever subject matter we're exploring. What have others said about this particular topic? Can we add to their interpretation? Do we agree or disagree with that interpretation? And ultimately, once we've done our work, we have the potential to create our own histories. So join me on our first episode of This Old Historian, Killed by a Train, the brutal death of a Civil War veteran. Years ago, I was working on my dissertation, and I stumbled upon an article that immediately grabbed my attention. Great work, newspaper editor from 1901. You're still attracting readers. Look at that headline: John Low's body ground into a sickening sight. I wondered, what the hell happened? Who was John Low? I kept reading. John Low was an inmate, an interesting word, at the New York Soldiers and Sailors Home in Bath, New York. I continued. Low met death, as the paper says, struck and instantly killed by a train on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad near the home. The article spared no gory detail. His body was literally cut into pieces. One of his legs was severed. His face was smashed in and unrecognizable. His jawbone was broken and protruded through the skin, and he was completely disemboweled. I was floored, moved by the gory detail relayed in the article, and curious about what may have happened. Who was John Low? What was a soldier's home like where Low was an inmate? The article offered more clues. Low was last seen in Bath on Tuesday evening. He was in possession of a state license to hawk, peddle, and vend, and a white pass meaning exemplary conduct from the soldier's home. He was 55, formerly from Buffalo. He was a member of the 84th New York Infantry, and bore an excellent reputation. The article didn't offer much on why he may have been killed. As the article states, he evidently started for the soldier's home, and when he reached Cook's Point, he probably cut across the lane on the railroad tracks and started up the tracks for the home. He was evidently walking toward the train that struck him. Wow. Let's recap everything we got out of this source. The article published in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle on December 6, 1901. John Low was hit and killed by a train on December 4th. He was an inmate or veteran living at the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Bath, New York. He was 55, formerly of Buffalo. He had a good reputation. He was a member of the 84th New York State Militia or Infantry. The article speculates that he may have used the tracks as a shortcut, but also states that he was walking in the direction of the train that hit him. This is an incredible amount of information that poses so many questions for me. Again, who was John Low? Why was he staying at the soldier's home? What was it like at the soldier's home? What was the nature of his military service? And perhaps, most interestingly, what happened? Was this truly an accident, as the article seems to indicate? Let's dive into a few more sources. The next source I found was another article. This one was published on the same day, December 6, 1901, 2 days after John Low was killed. Here we see another sensational headline. Dead body was frozen stiff. Civil War veteran run over and instantly killed. He was crushed to jelly. Here we have another interesting clue. Another old soldier met death on the rail. Another, so interesting. He was probably walking up the tracks on his way to the home When he was killed, the article states, he walked into his death, the train striking him squarely in the face. He had been in the home since April last. He was late of Company H, 84th Regiment of Volunteers, and a pensioner at $6. The most interesting piece of this article is this part. Another old soldier met death on the rail. How many were killed on the tracks near the home, and why? Here's another newspaper source I found. This one is from several years later in 1914. Crossing a railroad bridge near the soldier's home at Bath on Saturday, Archibald Hunt, a war veteran, was struck and instantly killed by a fast freight train. Mr. Hunt was the 16th victim killed by a train on the same bridge. One of the coolest things about practicing history is trying to find out who people were. What sources can we find, and what can we get out of those sources? I often tell my students, squeeze every drop out of the source that's in front of you like it's a wet towel. Again, we're very lucky to be 21st century historians and to have access to so much information on the internet, like Ancestry.com. It wasn't long before I was able to find relevant information about John Lowe. The first source is absolutely fascinating. Let's take a look. This is John Lowe's military record, and it tells us many important things. He enlisted in July of 1864 in New York. This record confirms he served with the 84th New York Infantry. He was discharged in October of the same year. The stated reason was because his term had expired. He was disabled, according to the record, if I'm reading the handwriting correctly. He had rheumatism and possibly cardiac hypertrophy or enlarged heart. John Lowe suffered from since the war. He had a light complexion, gray eyes, dark hair. He was a hatter and had lived in Chicago. He could read and write. He was a Protestant and was not married. Lastly, the record states he was killed by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad cars. Once I had a better understanding of who John Lowe was and what may have happened to him, I wanted to know more about the Bath Soldiers and Sailors home he was living in when he was killed. Fortunately, there are some detailed works about the home. I read those books and ultimately contacted Robert Yacht, a local historian and expert on the subject. The Grand Army of the Republic was a powerful veterans organization that advocated on behalf of over 2 million Union veterans after the Civil War. They undertook a massive campaign to raise money for the care of disabled veterans, an effort that resulted in the establishment of facilities like the Bath Soldiers and Sailors Home in 1878. Here's Yacht on the emergence of the GAR.
Well, it was the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, as you know, New York State had, they had given the most men and material and money to the war effort. And when they all came home at the promises that we're going to take care of the veterans, well, the legislature could never appropriate any of the money. And even though they said, yes, they could have as early as 1872, 73, they could have a soldiers' home, they never appropriated the money. So the Grand Army of the Republic, which is how I got to writing my second book, was they were the forefathers of the American Legion. They were a group of Union veterans, and they banded together, and that's a complete whole story altogether. But they banded together, and they were a veteran organization, and they, reminded the public that, we saved the Union for you guys, and you promised to take care of us, and the public, New York State residents, responded overwhelmingly. And then it was just another chore of where we're going to locate this soldiers' home, and that's a whole new story. And that's how I got to write that first book. That is how we met.
Early efforts to establish veteran homes and provide other forms of government-supported veteran services were largely successful and supported by much of the American public.
Oh, my God, everybody was so happy, and they had 5 locations. They wanted to build this soldiers' home across New York State, and they were actually competing, and the newspapers were writing stories about the other locations, and it was, all good-natured and everything, but back then they wanted to host this. They wanted to have these veterans.
Despite the early success, the popularity of soldiers' homes like the one in Bath inevitably created challenges as veterans flocked to the home.
When they designed that home, they didn't know. They looked to the French. They looked at a lot of other these places on what was the best way to design these homes for full capacity and everything, and that's how they built these with the large dorms and built them up. And I think one of the earlier things they realized was they was going to have to provide more beds sooner or later as these veterans began to, how popular the home was in the early days and how quickly it was filling up.
Veterans were required to pay a portion of their pension and to follow fairly strict rules set by the administration of the home, including limitations to the amount of alcohol they were allowed to consume on the premises.
Well, you had to have been an honorably discharged soldier, first of all, from the Union Army. That was first and foremost, and Specifically, it was going to be for New York State, but then they started to allow other soldiers in there. But you had to. Now it's funny because with the alcohol consumption and ale and everything like that, that was something that they had battled with over the years. But you had to be of good standing, and I'm not sure how stringent you had to be, but you had to agree to the rules. It was a semi-military organization. You still had to stand formation. You still had your duties you had to do. You still had a code of conduct you had to follow by. And you had to agree to this and how the pension was being paid out and such.
Despite the strict rules, especially the regulations on liquor, alcohol consumption remained a challenge as veterans routinely patronized the many bars in Bath.
But as far as the drinking goes, I mean, I don't know about the alcohol, but for the ale and the beer and stuff, now they had to look, that was two sides of the same coin, One, if you let them have their alcohol, their beer and stuff, and I think they had, when they had the store open, there was 2 beers in the forenoon and 1 in the afternoon. You're allowed 3 a day or something. But they said it was better than these guys going downtown to find it, at the grog shops and everything downtown. They would rather have that on location where they could keep an eye on them. So the argument was both ways. On pension day, when they got their pension, they could go out the gate. And this is where you start talking about them getting hit by the trains and such.
The Dependent and Disability Pension Act of 1890 expanded Civil War pension eligibility for Union veterans. It granted pensions to veterans who had served at least 90 days and were disabled enough to be unable to do manual labor, even if the disability was not caused by military service. It also extended pension benefits to widows and minor children in some cases. The law had a dramatic impact on the Bath Soldiers' Home as more veterans became eligible to stay there, and by the dawn of the 20th century, the Bath Soldiers' Home and others like it were overcrowded.
And what that did, that gave everybody, pension for their service. It was small and not enough to, certainly sustain your whole family and stuff, but it was nice supplemental pay. And you'll notice as the home, as you said, in 1902 or whatever, that all of a sudden, or 1906, that all of a sudden, I mean, these soldiers are getting older, they're getting frailer, they're getting hard to take care of, and you got to remember, this was called a soldier's home. This was a place for them to go live out their last years in peace and comfort and ease.
This letter was written by Mrs. A.C. Ackerman, a woman working at the home. According to Yacht, women were not permitted to work in the home until 1891, though at least one record indicates a woman was hired as a matron in 1884. I found this letter in a report submitted to the New York State Assembly by the State Department of Health. It was written in 1901, the same year John Lowe was killed, actually just a few weeks after he was killed, and it details the challenges the soldiers and staff were facing. It's addressed to the president of the New York State Board of Health in Albany, New York, the state capital, and it reads, "Sir, I and others who are somewhat interested in the matter are anxious to know if there is a general law throughout the state forbidding persons to inhabit and sleep in cellars, or does such a law only appertain to New York City? If there is such a law, will you kindly inform me where and how a copy of such law can be obtained? The reason I ask," she continues, "for such information is this. There is now at the Soldiers and Sailors Home in this place in the neighborhood of 200 veterans of the late Civil War compelled to sleep in the cellars under the barracks, which are mostly built on made ground and are damp and unhealthy. Also a number of sick men who are compelled to sleep in the cellars of the hospital, the place being overcrowded. Hoping to receive an answer to this, you will permit me to subscribe myself. Yours respectfully, Mrs. A.C. Ackerman." How interesting. Overcrowded and unhealthy. Some of the records confirm that many of the deaths at the home were the result of suicide, but many questions remain about the exact number and the reason for the amount of potential suicides. Robert helped me begin to answer some of my initial questions. The Bath Soldiers' Home was one of many soldiers' homes established for disabled veterans after the Civil War. The Grand Army of the Republic was a powerful veterans organization that were largely responsible for establishing these homes. The Bath Home quickly gained a good reputation for the care it provided. By the late 19th century, however, the Bath Home became overcrowded as more veterans sought its services. Many veterans were killed while living at the home. Some of those deaths are recorded as suicides, and others, like John Lowe's, wasn't. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this process. We started with one article with a graphic headline. We were able to quickly connect it to other primary sources, other newspaper articles, and John Lowe's military record. We consulted with an expert who had written several books on the subject. Thank you, Robert. Check out his website, yachtbooks.com. But there are still many unanswered questions. The most obvious one is, was John Lowe's death an accident, Or did he die by suicide? I just don't think the sources at this point allow us to say anything definitively. What we can say is veterans like John Lowe and others struggled in post-Civil War America, despite meaningful efforts to support them. Government-sponsored programs expanded dramatically after the war. Still, veterans struggled as communities across the country failed to sustain robust efforts to support them. I think it's also worth mentioning here how enormous the challenge was. Some estimates state there were over 2 million Union veterans who survived the war. 2 million. There's a very important book that addresses this topic by a scholar named Theda Skocpol. It's called Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, The Political Origins of Social Policy in the United States. In it, Skocpol points out that U.S. military pensions prior to the 1860s were minimal compared to what was to come with the mass mobilizing Civil War and its political aftermath. She goes on to make a larger argument that the United States built one of its earliest and most expansive social policy systems around Civil War veterans benefits, rather than around universal welfare programs. However, as the Civil War generation died off, the political power it wielded faded, and veterans programs were left underfunded. Wow, what a journey we just took. Look at all this one article led us to, all the doors it opened for us, and there are still so many for us left to open. I remain interested in the role women played working at the home. I'm also very interested in the stories of the Black veterans who lived at the home. What were their experiences like compared to the white veterans? I'm also very interested in the addiction services provided at the home. I would love to find veteran accounts that potentially speak to this or their general challenges with alcoholism or drug abuse. But that's it for now. Thank you for joining me. For This Old Historian, I'm Nick Toney.